Hello and welcome to the Music Professor channel. I'm here with Loki and I've just been playing Allegri's Miserere, or the beginning of Allegri's Miserere. The very start you heard with the aid of technology for the first time on one of my videos. There's been a slight enhancement of my voice in order to enable me to reach the famous high C in Allegri's Miserere, which is a note, an absolutely famous note, but in fact is not part of the original piece and is probably the result of some kind of strange, accidental but partly deliberate editing by a Victorian editor. I'll tell you about that in a minute. The whole history of Allegri's Miserere is a sort of mythical one and a fascinating one. And the reason why we're talking about Allegri's Miserere today is that it is a sort of mythical piece, isn't it? It's the sort of ultimate piece of church music that people often think of. Everyone who's ever encountered it, I mean, I remember hearing it as a teenager in a record shop and almost having a heart-stopping moment when I heard the famous High C and thinking, how incredibly beautiful, what is this music? I had no idea that it was the famous piece of music that Mozart once wrote down when he visited Rome in 1770. So let's start off with that myth. I guess I'm thinking about Allegri's Miserere because my wife and I had our silver wedding anniversary last week and we were in Rome. We had an amazing time in Rome and we were in the Sistine Chapel looking at the astonishing things that are there. And by the way, the Sistine Chapel, it's not just the ceiling and Michelangelo's famous Last Judgment. It's also the wonderful early Renaissance frescoes that surround you on the walls. And it's so extraordinary that you have to, if you ever get there, do take time to sit down on one of the stone seats at the side of the chapel and just sort of sit and gaze in wonder, because it's an extraordinary space. And in that room, which will soon be the site of the papal conclave to choose the next pope. Probably that's happening right now because, of course, I'm recording a week or two prior to the release of this video. So Sistine Chapel, very much something that's in everyone's mind. And Allegri's Miserere, of all the music that's associated with that space, this is the piece. But what is it? It certainly is not a piece of music that was just written down by Allegri and it was a masterpiece, you know, there and then. It's not like, for example, Beethoven's Missa Solemnis. You know, Beethoven in the 1820s very deliberately wrote this huge mass, and he very intentionally wanted it to be his masterpiece, that kind of idea. Or even what Bach did in the 1740s when he compiled his amazing B minor mass. It's not like that. It's, of course, a relatively small motet for two choirs that sing antiphonally with bits of Gregorian chant sort of coming in from time to time. So it was essentially a piece that was devised by Gregorio Allegri, a musician who was singing in the papal choir in the 1630s. And Allegri devised this piece, I would say, as using a technique that he'd learned from his own teachers. It was sort of common practice within the papal choir at that time to devise a kind of way of harmonizing Gregorian chant. So instead of just having an unaccompanied chant all the time, you'd have bits where the choir would sing a harmony. So instead of intoning on one note, you'd have harmony with people would be intoning the text of the psalm, but it would be done with chords instead of just a single line. And then you would write these sort of richly harmonized cadence points using the sort of standard endings that had become common practice within the liturgical music of the period. So we're really talking about a culture of clichés, if you like. I mean, I dare I use a word like that. I'm a great believer in cliché, because cliché, tropes, these are the things, these are the devices that we develop because they work and they're effective, and then we could employ them in an ingenious and creative way. I would say Mozart, who's going to be a topic of today's video, a lot of his compositions consist of organising tropes of style in an absolutely inspired way. That's what great composers often do. Allegri's Miserere is a bit like that, but what you have is a bunch of tropes, if you like, chants and cadences that choirs could then embellish in their own way. So it's very much an improvisational tool. And we know this because the multiple editions of Miserere that have come down to us over the centuries, they're all different, and they all show different versions of embellishment that the choir would have used, and Allegri intended it that way. Okay, I'll tell you more about this in a minute, because there's an extraordinary story behind the version that we know today. But in 1770, Mozart visited Rome with his dad. He was 14 years of age. And Leopold, who was very much a kind of tiger dad and taking his son all around Europe, kind of showing the prodigious talent of this boy to the world. Leopold very much believed that his son was a miracle. He almost had a kind of Christ-like view of his son as a gift of God to humanity. And maybe he wasn't wrong. Mozart did have an extraordinary gift, and his father had given him very, very impressive skills as a very small musician. These skills, by the way, had been monitored. When he came to London in 1764, he met an English gentleman called Daines Barrington, who was a member of the Royal Society and a lawyer. And Barrington subjected Mozart to a sort of scientific analysis to check that it wasn't just myth, it was real. There's something very modern about that, isn't it? I mean, we live in a period when all sorts of fake news is abounding, as it was in the 18th century, and Daines Barrington decided he wanted to check that this boy was the real thing, and he gave him all sorts of difficult things to do. He had to improvise recitatives and arias and all sorts of things, and this little tiny boy did it. You know, he created his own on-the-spot Italian aria, making up a kind of gibberish text, apparently. And he got completely distracted when a cat came into the room. All sorts of, it's an amazing, fascinating description. Anyway, I'm off topic. So let's move forward 6 years from Daines Barrington's famous tests, Royal Society tests of Mozart's prodigious talent. Well, I'll talk about that in more detail in another video. But 1770, he was 14, they were visiting Rome, and they went into the Sistine Chapel. It was Holy Week. And leading up to Holy Week, a lot of penitential music gets sung. Allegri's Miserere sets the text of Psalm 51, which is the legend is it's by King David himself. After he'd committed adultery with Bathsheba, he sang this terribly penitential psalm. And it's that psalm that sets to music by Allegri in this way. And the way that it works is that it kind of goes round and round and round. The basic material of the music turns round and round, and it absolutely makes sense that Mozart at the age of 14 could have written it down, because actually it's like an ear test. You hear it several times, you've got a chance to process it, and then you write it down. He didn't write it down in the chapel, he went home to his lodgings and wrote it down that evening. And we know that he did this because in April the 14th, 1770, Leopold Mozart, his dad, wrote to his mother, "You have often heard of the famous Miserere in Rome, which is so greatly prized that the performers in the chapel are forbidden on pain of excommunication to take away a single part of it, to copy it, or to give it to anyone. But we have it already. Wolfgang has written it down, and we would have it sent to Salzburg in this letter if it were not necessary for us to be there to perform it. The manner of performance must play a greater role than the work itself, which actually alludes to what we've been talking about, the sort of improvisational way in which it's performed by choirs, and traditionally at any rate. And as it is one of the secrets of Rome, we don't want it to fall into the wrong hands. There's a lot of controversy about this statement, whether or not there was some kind of papal ban on the piece. It seems likely that there wasn't, but Leopold is making that case in his letter. And the following May the 19th, Leopold wrote again to his wife from Naples to say, when we read the article, so there's obviously been a newspaper article about what Mozart had done, the article on the Miserere, we couldn't help laughing out loud. There's not the slightest cause for anxiety. People are making far more of it elsewhere. The whole of Rome knows, even the Pope knows, that Wolfgang wrote down the Miserere. There's absolutely nothing to be afraid of, quite the opposite. It's done him great credit, as you'll shortly be hearing. And then in July 1770, the Mozarts were summoned back to Rome, and Pope Clement XIV showered praise upon the boy and gave him the chivalric Order of the Golden Spur. So all of this is stuff that actually happened, and this came up on the channel because we had some quizzes about this incident, and of course myth making happens and we don't know exactly what did happen, but we do know that Mozart did go back to his lodgings and wrote the piece down as best he could. And of course, when you're writing something down orally, it's one thing to write out the notes, but actually to plot out all the different parts and how the counterpoint worked on a score of several staves is impressive by any standards. I mean, heaven knows, he was a talented lad. So it's a fascinating story. Maybe there are elements of myth. People have suggested that Mozart, because when he went to London, the trip that I was telling you about, and met Daines Barrington that I mentioned a minute ago. On that trip, it's possible, because in London there were various copies of the Miserere already publicly viewable, apparently, or you could hear them performed. It's possible that he had already heard it, who knows, but it's a nice story. So, okay, now, here's the next fascinating piece in the jigsaw puzzle, because let me show you one or two things about how the Miserere works. Okay, let's have a look at a single detail just to illustrate what I'm talking about, how this piece sort of developed and how the embellishments and things work. So have a look at this. This comes from one edition of the Miserere, and it's what you get is an opening section, then a bit of plain chant, and then an answering section where the other choir sings the response. So in one edition, that answer goes like this. So you notice it goes to that sort of dominant, what we call a Phrygian cadence, and then closes. Now look at this. In another edition of it, you'll see that the same thing happens, and then here, look at the soprano. This chord just gets extended while this happens. Now that we don't normally hear, but in this edition you get an Italian sixth. Do you remember my video a few weeks ago about Italian sixths? It was making exactly this point, that augmented sixths come out of improvisation. The vocalist sharpens that note, and then we go to G minor, and then cadencing on to D, chord 5 of G minor. Fascinating. So there's an example of how the papal choir was embellishing it. Now, in 1830, the young Mendelssohn did something very similar to what the young Mozart had done. It's obviously a thing that young geniuses did. He went to Rome and he wrote it down. He took his own transcription of it, also from memory. And he wrote this passage. So this passage that I've just been playing, this bit, with the embellishment and so on. He took that, but listen, he wrote this with these little embellished grace notes. There's the augmented sixth, and then he wrote this out. Now you notice that it's a whole fourth higher than the published version. And the reason for that is the papal choir apparently were in the habit of performing a substantial interval above the normal notation. I don't know why that was, but clearly that was the custom in the Sistine Chapel. So Mendelssohn, because he had perfect pitch, wrote it out in that key. Now here's the weird thing. In 1880, when Grove's Dictionary published an article about Allegri's Miserere for their famous dictionary, a gentleman called William Rockstro wrote the article, and he mentions Mendelssohn's transcription. He mentions how Mendelssohn had described the Miserere as something sublime, and in the article, Rockstro recreates the score. But the fascinating thing is he basically creates his own version. He composes it. Now, other commentators on the Miserere have suggested that this was just, he kind of bungled it and did something, he made a mistake. I think he actually made a sort of creative decision, a sort of creative edit, which is deeply problematic musicologically, but in fact it gave rise to the beautiful thing that everyone loves about Allegri's Miserere. In other words, Allegri's Miserere, as we know it today, is essentially a sort of Victorian creation. Now, of course, the music itself is as it always has been in terms of the sound of the harmony and so on, but Rockstro did this weird thing. So I'll show you what he did. So the second choir's answering section, this bit. Now, what should happen is that in the original, the second choir sings this, and they cadence in G major. So that's what they should sing. Instead, Rockstro wrote the first three chords, then breaks off, and then he puts in Mendelssohn's transcription of the first phrase, upper fourth. Now, instead of doing what Mendelssohn originally wrote with the grace notes, he puts it into straight minims, and that's where we get our famous high C from. Isn't that extraordinary? So it's really re-editing. Either it's a mistake. I think it's probably a very deliberate piece of Victorian sublimity, a sort of, oh, look at this beautiful thing. Let's do what Mendelssohn did and put it up a fourth to make it sound spectacular. And a lot of people have noticed, I mean, we've all probably noticed that moment where it seems incongruous, really, that suddenly there's a soprano soaring away and you're thinking, goodness, that's high. That's because it shouldn't really be there at all. It's a fourth higher than it's meant to be, and it's been put in the wrong place anyway by Mr. Rockstro. So it's a piece that's sort of semi-improvised. It was put together out of fragments of, originally compiled, if you like, out of fragments of harmonised plain chant. Choirs were in the habit of improvising. Mozart and Mendelssohn both transcribed it at various stages in its history. Rockstro in the 1880s created this curious hybrid of versions with the famous high C, by mistake or by design, we don't know. So, but whatever the story, what it tells you is that these extraordinary things that we all know and love are sometimes oddly piecemeal. You might say there's a kind of organic history there. It's sort of emerged bit by bit, but Rockstro's contribution is really weird, and that high C is sort of wrong, but of course right in a sense. So there we are, Allegri's Miserere, enjoy. And there are some things in the video description. If you look below, if you want to look into this in more detail, there are links to other videos about Allegri's Miserere and other performances where they sing it better than I do. Thanks for watching.